Hello from London, it's Thoughts on Thursday, and today I want to explore in depth translation as a language learning method. First of all, if you're new here, hello, I'm Dr. Gareth Popkins. Here we talk about language learning from many angles. If you haven't yet subscribed for the vibe, please do, and you can get my free Language Learner Pro webinar training by following the link underneath this video. Now, it's fair to say that translation as a technique for learning languages is a bit of a controversial subject. I've met many experienced language learners who swear by it, use it all the time. Others who are actually hostile and say it's not only a waste of time, but it actually has negative effects. And that's an attitude, I think, which many language teachers in a classroom situation, for example, in schools, have had or have been seen to have in at least previous decades, although I think it is changing now. Because it did go out of fashion, and it went out of fashion, I think, in the 1950s and early 60s when the communicative method of language learning teaching started to really take off. That was a method which put the emphasis on using the target language as much as possible. I wanted to distance itself from the old-fashioned grammar translation method, which was seen as really fusty, which had been overhang from the 19th century when Greek and Latin, a classical linguistic education, was seen to be crucial, and translating from Greek or Latin into your mother tongue, English, German, French, whatever it was a major method. Now, this had sort of got carried over in the first half of the 20th century into modern language teaching, with the result that you had students who had finished high school, several years learning a language, or even finished university, and they were unable to speak the modern language. This hadn't been a problem with teaching Latin and Greek because nobody was expecting to speak them, and really translation had been used as a sort of test of comprehension, I think, in those languages. But while it may have done that for modern languages as well, people were leaving without being able to speak. So there was a swing towards focusing on communication in language teaching. Now, let's move first to talk then about some of the arguments against translation in a bit more detail. One pretty strong argument against translation is that it can encourage misconceptions as to the very nature of language. The idea that language maps word for word from your native language into the target language. When in fact it's much, much messier than that. It's not just a question of saying the same words but with different sounds, as it were. So the meaning of words can overlap. For example, the Russian word druk is usually translated as friend. But in practice, the meaning is more akin to a close friend, a very good friend. The word priyatel, which is usually translated as acquaintance, is used far more often in Russian, when in English we'd use the word friend. So it's not a direct mapping. And that's before you get to differences in sentence structure and grammar, or in stylistic conventions, for example, collocations, the way words are traditionally used together, simply because that's the way it's always been done. So in English, for example, we talk about sitting an exam, but in Welsh you wouldn't translate that literally. You'd say sefyll arholiad, to stand an exam. You get to more complicated sentences, even something like my name is Gareth or I am Gareth. In Welsh you'd say Gareth ydw i, which means literally Gareth am I. It's a completely different structure. In Russian, меня зовут Gareth. Me call they Gareth. They call me Gareth, literally. Very, very different, and you could quickly get tangled up in knots if you take a translation approach, perhaps, to learning a language. Another argument is that translation's really a rather inefficient use of the limited time that you have to spend learning a language. So when you're doing translation exercises, whether into or out of your target language, you could actually be producing some original target language. You could be doing some creative writing, for example, or some speaking practice, or you could be getting some good input, some reading or some listening. It can be argued that there are better ways then of using your time than spending it doing what's rather an unnatural activity, translating backwards and forwards, that you're not really going to need much in real life. Finally, the old argument in the days of Latin and Greek that translation was a great way of testing comprehension sort of falls down as well too, because surely there are better ways of testing comprehension. So you can ask people questions about a text that they've read or something that they've heard in the target language. Again, you're using much more of the target language. Now, these seem to me to be arguments, all of which have a good dose of truth in them. But to use, again, an idiom which might be difficult to translate, we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So now let's look at some of the arguments in favour of using translation as a language learning tool in your arsenal. Now, in recent years then, translation has made actually something of a comeback. There's been a bit of a reaction against the extreme version of the communicative method in language learning teaching. And L1, your native language, has sort of been readmitted into the classroom to a certain extent. There's a realisation that actually it's sometimes quicker to explain things to people in their native language, that we're not learning just like children from scratch, and it doesn't have to be completely a recreation of that long and tedious and difficult process that children have to go through to learn a language. So the benefits then of translation, well, one of the first ones is that it really puts you on the spot. It shines a light onto your weaknesses of expression in your target language. So if you're translating into English and you can't translate it, it's really clear that you do not understand. If you're translating the other way into the target language, there's no way that you can sort of speak round the problem, as I'd encourage you to do when you're in a conversation. So you might be talking about my house, you've forgotten the word for house, you might say the place that I live, yeah, or that building over there. You're actually supposed to be as true as possible in your translation. You don't have that escape route, and it really shines a light then on something that you need to learn. In that process, and here's the second point, it really helps you to notice and remember. There's nothing like not being able to do something to sort of sear it into your consciousness. So the fact that you've got to solve this problem in a direct way, in a way, can actually help you to retain the knowledge, acquire the structures and the vocabulary. Now, it's true that doing some freehand writing in a language can have the same effect, and that's great too, in the sense that there's nowhere to hide from your mistakes. But again, you can perhaps creatively dodge the bullet by paraphrasing a bit more or saying something different if you're simply writing a creative essay, for example. The thing with translation is that you're trying to be as accurate as possible, respecting the different rhetorical traditions, grammar, the different meaning of words and the different overlaps or non-overlaps, as we said earlier, of words in the two languages. And then finally, the argument that translation is divorced from what you need to do in real life, while containing, of course, a lot of truth, is not the whole picture. Now, yes, the holy grail for us as language learners is probably that we want to think in the target language. It's this sort of look no hands idea. I've taken off, I'm doing everything in my target language. But initially, when we start off, we're going to be translating in our head anyway. There's no escaping that. We're not like little children learning our first language. We've already got the language and the concept of our native language and other languages that we've learned, if we've done more than one already, in our head. Might as well accept that. And then, of course, we might in real life anyway have to translate for others. If we're the only person in our group when we're travelling who knows the target language, or if we want to help somebody on the street who's clearly having difficulties understanding. And actually, there's something to be said then for seeing this role as a mediator, as an interpreter, if it's, of course, all translation, as actually something to be developed as a skill in its own right. Cultural mediation, if you like, is sometimes called the fifth of the language learning skills, with reading, speaking, listening and writing. So it's maybe something actually that we should be embracing. We've seen then that there are some arguments against using translation, and they're ones that we need to be aware of and to take seriously. But we've also seen that there are some real positive arguments, a positive case that you can make in favour of this technique, as one of a range of methods as you try to get fluent in a foreign language. I actually think that the old grammar translation method has had a bit of a bad rap. Because the fact is that if all you do is translate from the language that you're learning into your native language, or even the other way, yes, it's pretty likely that you might understand the grammar pretty well and have a good vocab, but you come to the country, you won't be able to understand people or to say very much yourself. But just because there's a correlation between using that method and not being able to speak or understand doesn't mean it's a relationship of causation. No, what's going on there is that people have been over-reliant on the grammar translation method. And they've spent far too little time, perhaps in the past, listening and speaking and getting practice in those skills. Because at the end of the day, if you want to be able to understand and to speak, of course, you've got to practice doing those an awful lot. But that, as I say, does not mean that there isn't a place for translation as part of a wider set of tools in your language learning. In the next video then, I'm going to look at ideas for how you could actually give translation a go, as I say, as part of a wider range of techniques that you bring to bear as a language learner. But having seen this video, how do you feel about the debate at this stage? Do you think translation has had a bad rap, or is it something you've been using for years, or that you'd like to try out? Well, let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for the vibe, throw me a thumbs up, tickle that bell, and share the affair. See you soon. Chili.